I know as attorney for Lyndon Johnson that he murdered John Kennedy. He murdered John Kennedy to become president and to avoid prison, and there is no doubt. But the real name, the name used in the backwards that didn't appear in the newspapers, was Lyon Lyndon, and that stuck with him the rest of his life.
That rigged ballot became the template for a political career based on bribery and corruption. The full extent of Johnson's criminal activity only began to unravel 11 years after his death. In 1984, at this courthouse in Franklin, Texas, a former Johnson business associate, Billy Celestes, appeared before a grand jury.
According to Billy Celestes, there were 8 murders perpetrated on the part of Lyndon Johnson, and they were all killed with carbon monoxide. Josepha Johnson's name is listed on this Justice Department document. That's Lyndon Johnson's sister. So Estes is accusing the Vice President of the United States of murdering his own sister. And the 8th name listed is the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And then there is a promise of knowing more. And if Billy Celestes is telling the truth, and there is every reason to believe he is, it gives you an idea of the depth of the corruption and the ruthlessness of Lyndon Johnson.
Agricultural official had begun investigating one of Johnson's illegal sources of funding. Working out of these offices in Bryan, Texas, Marshall had become aware of Billy Celestes' misappropriation of federal cotton allotment funds. Attempts to buy off Marshall had failed, and his investigations were beginning to threaten the vice president himself.
Billy Celestes became worried. Lyndon Johnson became worried. And some of them got together and decided, what are we going to do with Henry Marshall? So on one particular day, according to Billy Celestes, Cliff Carter, an aide to Lyndon Johnson, the Vice President of the United States, and Malcolm Wallace got together. And finally, Lyndon made the statement, get rid of him.
On June the 3rd, 1961, Henry Marshall failed to return home. An extensive search was made of the family farm near Franklin, Texas. His only son, Don, was 11 years old at the time and remembers that day well.
My uncle found him on the second attempt when he went out to the place. He was in a very remote location, probably about 3/4 of a mile off the road. My mother had this stone placed here in order to mark the spot. The truck had blood around the sides of it. The side on the passenger side had a dent in the fender behind the passenger door, and that's apparently where my father's head was knocked into the side of the truck, and he had his eye damaged at that point. There were a number of yopon bushes that had been broken, and the gun was laying beside the body, and pretty much nothing else could be seen except signs of a struggle.
Local officials immediately ruled it a suicide, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
He had been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. He had enough carbon monoxide in his lungs to cause him to pass out at the time he died. There was no effort made to collect any evidence or preserve the crime scene. They had pretty much determined in their minds that this was going to be a suicide. When Billy Celestes testified before the grand jury in Franklin, he implicated Cliff Carter and Malcolm Wallace as the people that were most involved in my father's murder. Wallace being the trigger man and Cliff Carter being the one who arranged for the murder. I'm firmly convinced that Malcolm Wallace was the killer of my father. Who that would have aided, probably political power behind everything. Johnson would have been aided more than anyone else.
The grand jury concluded Henry Marshall in 1961 was murdered, which means in simple language that the grand jury believed Billy Celestes when he told them that Lyndon Johnson had ordered Malcolm Wallace to kill Henry Marshall.
But Johnson's dark dealings were not confined to Texas. In late summer 1963, one of his long-term partners in crime was about to be exposed for corruption by a Senate investigation.
Bobby Baker was the secretary to the Senate majority. Basically, he was the secretary for the Senate, and he was one of Lyndon Johnson's closest associates. And everything that Lyndon Johnson wanted to perpetrate, he had Bobby's help. Essentially, if somebody wanted to get a military contract and they wanted influence of Lyndon Johnson to help them, they had to pay off Bobby Baker, who would then pay off Lyndon Johnson. It's the world of bribes. Bobby Baker was involved in a call girl service. He was involved in real estate scams. He was involved in dealings with organized crime. He was in dealings with oil men, particularly Clint Murchison, an oil millionaire from Texas. So as a result of all this, Bobby Baker was in big trouble. And with a little bit of inspiration on the part of the Kennedys that they could get Bobby Baker to talk, Lyndon was all done. Lyndon Baines Johnson, if Robert Kennedy had his way, would not only not be on the 1964 ticket as the vice presidential candidate, but he would go to jail for the corruption that he was involved with.
Although Johnson faced political extinction at the hands of the Kennedys, he had powerful allies with their own agendas that threatened the president, as researcher Gregory Burnham explains.
And people would think that he had no enemies. He was so popular. He smiled. He appeared happy. Everyone loved him worldwide. But what people don't seem to understand is behind the scenes, he was making changes, and he was making them decisively, and he was taking some very, very daring steps. He was committed to pull out of Vietnam. By October, he had signed a document, NSAM 263, to that effect. 1,000 troops home by Christmas, and all personnel out of Vietnam by 1965. But that wasn't very good for the military-industrial complex. His abolishing the Central Intelligence Agency, pulling their teeth, holding them to task, back to why they were originally created by Truman. Their original mandate by law is only to coordinate intelligence, not to create the Bay of Pigs. NSAM 55 told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the CIA no longer can do that, and any military operation has to come directly from them to the president, period. That kind of a document really causes problems.
Texas was home to Kennedy's most dangerous opponents.
Oil millionaires and billionaires in Texas were petrified of one major factor that John F. Kennedy was considering, cutting the oil depletion allowance. And there was no way they were going to allow that. Essentially, they would save billions of dollars if it stays as it is. It was called a 27.5% oil depletion allowance. John Kennedy thought it was too liberal. One of the key men in this case is Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire, owned 500 companies, but he was primarily an oil millionaire. He also controlled Texas, controlled Johnson. His major means of operating and controlling people and influencing people was a little hotel called the Hotel Del Charro in La Jolla, California. It cost $100 a day in the 50s. And at that hotel, he would invite all these powerful, influential people. Richard Nixon would come there. Key lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the head of the mafia in New Orleans, used to vacation there. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, used to vacation there. Free. Every summer for 10 summers. Free.
Another Johnson man with close ties to Murchison was a wealthy Texan called D.H. Byrd.
D.H. Byrd was an underboss for Murchison. He was a Del Charro regular. He owned the Texas School Book Depository. He also founded the Civil Air Patrol, which was a kind of military organization, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. Another associate of Murchison at the time is Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker's in trouble with the scandals, and he was in all kinds of business deals with Murchison, and many of them were illegal. So Murchison was concerned that Baker and that corruption would lead to his door. And maybe not only would Baker go to jail and Lyndon go to jail, but maybe Murchison would go to jail.
As the forces hostile to Kennedy grew in strength and number, they began to think the unthinkable: assassination. Finally, a new imperative forced their hand.
Lyndon Johnson was in big trouble. The Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Celeste scandal could destroy Lyndon Johnson's career. Lyndon Johnson would go to jail, and he was their man. He represented all these right-wing forces. There was an urgency to kill President Kennedy. They had to save Lyndon Johnson. The governor of Texas, first of all, is Lyndon Johnson's best friend in history. They went back decades together. In the 1948 vote scandal, John Connally was every much a part of that cover-up that took place. He was his campaign manager. It is without question John Connally who entices John F. Kennedy to Texas. Once they get him there, then they're in control of everything. Motorcade routes, the evidence, the Dallas police, everything. It's their land. It's their territory. Lyndon Johnson and his Texas cronies suckered President Kennedy to Texas. If the head of the FBI and the head of the Secret Service and key lieutenants of those two figures are involved in covering up, plus the President of the United States and all his cronies, you don't need a massive conspiracy to get away with this.
After the assassination, Cliff Carter, Johnson's aide, made repeated calls from the White House to the district attorney in Dallas, Henry Wade. He was instructed to look no further than Oswald for the guilty man. There was no conspiracy. A similar call was made to the Attorney General of Texas, Waggoner Carr.
Then we have Lyndon Johnson himself calling the chief of homicide, Will Fritz, who's really doing the dirt work as far as interrogating Oswald and trying to get to the bottom of this case. He calls him and tells him, you have your man. You have your man. Let it go at that. Lyndon Johnson is trying to control what is going on with the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy from Washington, D.C., with crucial figures in the case.
From the moment he became president, Johnson had authority over every aspect of the cover-up of Kennedy's murder. He was unassailable.
Johnson has the power to contain the investigation, both nationally and locally, on the ground in Texas. More so than if it had happened, let's say, in Oregon or Wisconsin. Texas. He's got the power to give the CIA what it wants as president, as opposed to Kennedy, who they feared. He's got the power to take the National Security Action Memorandum that Kennedy had signed in November of 1963, tear it up, reverse it, and create a war where 3 million soldiers wound up going to Vietnam instead of 16,000 being brought home by JFK. He can make J. Edgar Hoover director of the FBI for life. He's the man in the middle. The only person that can answer all of the questions of who's at risk, who's going to gain the most, who wins in this deal, there's only one answer to that question, and that's Lyndon Johnson. And his ticket out was Elm Street.
The most compelling pieces of evidence linking Johnson with the assassination is through his henchman Malcolm Wallace, the convicted killer of Douglas Kinzer. In the hours following the assassination, on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building by the southeast corner window, the Dallas police discovered an unidentified fingerprint.
The fingerprint is the ultimate part of the Mac Wallace story. The FBI fingerprinted every Texas School Book Depository employee, including the women employees that worked downstairs, never handled the boxes. They fingerprinted every Dallas officer that was in the sniper's nest so that they could remove those fingerprints from consideration. At the end of the day, you have one fingerprint remaining. It sits in the National Archives for 35 years, until 1998. An investigator takes it to a highly qualified, certified latent print examiner, a CLPE, along with a redacted fingerprint card from Mac Wallace from the 1951 murder of John Douglas Kinzer. And he said, here's a print card. Do you see anything?
Nathan Darby is one of the most experienced fingerprint experts in the United States, with 35 years service in the U.S. military and the City of Austin Police Department.
I didn't know where it came from, and a week or 10 days later, I called party and that had brought it over and said, well, it's a match. The finger that made the ink print also made the latent. And we call that a match or identified. And there was no question about it. They matched.
3 years later, Nathan Darby readdressed the same evidence and reconfirmed his original findings.
When he was done, he had a 34-point match. And when you mention that in criminal circles to an investigator, how confident would you feel with a 34-point match? Oh, that's a slam dunk. It can't miss. It doesn't get any better than that. You give me a 34-point match on any case in the United States, I'll take it to court and win.
The inked and the latent print are made by the same finger. And the other evidence that I've been presented with was Malcolm Wallace's left little finger, without a reasonable doubt.
Now, the fingerprint in question came from a cardboard box in the sniper's nest in the Texas School Book Depository. Fingerprints do not last long on cardboard. So it's fair to say that either Malcolm Wallace was wandering around there for no purpose, or he was in that sniper's nest on November 22nd. That evidence, that fingerprint evidence, along with Malcolm Wallace's sordid resume, was sent to every imaginable agency or individual that could have an interest in what happened to John Kennedy. The only people that took notice of it were the Dallas police, because it's still an open homicide on their blotter. And they took serious notice of it. And then they were told, forward it up the line, because Dallas no longer has any evidence. It's all in federal hands, even though it's an unsolved homicide. They forwarded it up the line. And it took 18 months for the FBI to say verbally, no, it's not a match. And the single most important fingerprint found in the last 35 years was buried.
I don't know why they couldn't say that the thing didn't match. It did match. There's no question about it. My experience, I've just had too much experience. I know what I'm talking about. I'm positive. No question about it. My dying declaration, if I was to drop dead right now, they match.
It's still the big lie. It's unknown. It's unidentified. No, it's identified. It's Malcolm Wallace, and he's linked to Estes, Carter, and Lyndon B. Johnson directly.